Well, hello everybody, and welcome to today's Alumni Fellows reading series. Paul Kaplan will be speaking on his recently published Contraband Guides, Race, Transatlantic Culture, and the Arts in the Civil War Era. A former fellow and distinguished scholar of Renaissance art and representations of race in both European and American art, Paul Henry Daniel Kaplan is professor of art history at Purchase College at the State University of New York. The author of many significant books in his fields, including the classic Rise of the Black Magus in Western Art, he has provided important essays to the Image of the Black in Western Art series, edited by David Weinman and Henry Louis Gates Jr. Adrian L. Childs is serving as the discussant, an associate of the Hutchins Center, renowned curator and art historian. Dr. Childs is the author of Rifts and Relations, African American Artists and the European Modernist Tradition. It originated in the exhibition of the same name and is the recipient of the 5th annual James A. Porter and David C. Driscoll Book Award. Her current book project with Yale University Press is Ornamental Blackness, an exploration of race and representation in the decorative arts. Thank you for joining us, Paul and Adrian. And Paul, please start.
Thank you very much, Krishna, and thanks to the Hutchins Center for inviting me to give this presentation, and thanks to Adrian for serving as the discussant. I do want to get started right away, so I'm going to share my screen. There we go. All right. So I'm reading a couple of excerpts from my recently published book, which Krishna has mentioned, and you see its cover there on the screen. It's essentially a book about American artists and writers, both Black and white, reacting to the Black presence in European art and society just before, during, and just after the American Civil War. In a way, it recapitulates my own personal experience, having started to travel in Europe in the 1960s and beginning my study of images of people of color in European art, and having a kind of revelation which has implications for the American scene as well. The book is divided into a series of what you might call case studies, and I'll just briefly say a word about a few of the chapters. There's one on Emanuel Leutze, including his famous Washington crossing the Delaware, whose African figure you see here in this detail on the book cover, but also an artist who painted many other African Americans. A chapter on the mixed race sculptor Eugene Warburg, brought up in New Orleans, but working in Europe in the 1850s. And there's also a chapter about Charles Eliot Norton, the first American art historian at Harvard, and his correspondence with John Ruskin on race matters. I'm going to read from the last two chapters, a small excerpt from chapter 5, which is entitled Old Masters, and which is about the use of the Western tradition by Black educators and other civic leaders in the Civil War era. And then I'm going to read from the final chapter itself, entitled Contraband Guides. So, without further ado. The one indubitably great monument to the Civil War and emancipation, the monument to Robert Gould Shaw and the Massachusetts 54th Regiment, was first conceptualized and proposed by an African American. Joshua Bowen Smith, 1813 to 1879, a successful Cambridge caterer, political activist, and representative in the Massachusetts legislature, was one of the 1851 petitioners to the Massachusetts authorities for a proposed Crispus Attucks memorial monument. As early as 1842, Smith had been involved with anti-slavery agitation. He had evidently worked for the family of Robert Gould Shaw, and after the death of Colonel Shaw and many of his black troops in the assault at Fort Wagner, it was Smith, along with several unnamed other African Americans, who first conceived of a monument to this commander. Smith's good friend, the Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumner, by whom he was also employed, advised Smith to wait until the war's end. In October of 1865, Smith made a significant initial donation of $500 to the fund, issued a call for African American contributors, and, with Sumner, convened a committee to pursue the plan. Smith's vision was of an equestrian monument, and when several members of the committee challenged this, he took a hard and successful line against any alteration. At this early stage, it is not known if Smith or anyone else on the committee had in mind any representation of the troops under Shaw's command. Though a number of contributions to the fund were made, the project languished in the 1870s to be taken up again without either Smith or Sumner in the 1880s and reaching completion by the sculptor Augustus St. Gaudens in 1897, with the equestrian figure of Shaw still the centerpiece, but now complemented by a magnificent array of black infantrymen. In addition to Smith's advocacy for both the Attucks and Shaw monuments, his interest in the visual arts had other manifestations. In 1875, the British radical Charles Bradlaugh paid a visit to Smith's house in Cambridge, which he found to be something of a shrine to Sumner, who died the previous year, and abolition. Smith had portraits of William Lloyd Garrison and Sumner, and he also owned the senator's tea service and the wreath that had rested on Sumner's coffin. But his most singular possession was a painting that Sumner had willed to Smith, an oil painting measuring 3 by 4 feet, quote, said to be a Tintoretto, showing a white slave with bonds miraculously broken and against whom the executioner's weapons lose their force. This picture, much valued by Sumner, was specially willed to his much loved and much trusted colored friend. Quote from the early description of this. Though this particular work is not known today, Sumner's picture was clearly a version of Tintoretto's famous Miracle of the Slave, now in the Accademia in Venice, painted in 1548 for the Venetian Scuola Grande di San Marco. The Accademia painting, like the version owned by Sumner and Smith, features St. Mark breaking the bonds of a white Christian slave as he descends from the sky. Among the observers in the Accademia painting, however, are 2 dark-skinned Africans in Middle Eastern dress, who are presumably also present in Sumner's and Smith's smaller study, or more likely a copy after Tintoretto's original. Sumner, who had traveled extensively in Italy and elsewhere in Europe as a young man, was devoted to the visual arts and was a close friend of many American artists. He was also a collector of paintings, prints, and sculpture, and visitors to his house in Washington at the end of his life were impressed by his treasures and his taste. In his will, his few sculptures were left to Longfellow and Samuel Gridley Howe, but, except for his bequest of the Miracle of the Slave to Smith, all of his other paintings and prints were left to the new Boston Museum of Fine Arts, then being planned. The gift of the painting to Smith was not a casual choice. The sequence of events leading to the gift began by 1849, when John Greenleaf Whittier wrote an anti-slavery poem about Tintoretto's Miracle of the Slave and its story, later remarking that Sumner had called his attention precisely to the painting. Smith, who'd most likely grown up as a free person of color in Pennsylvania and lived for a time in New Bedford, played a public role in denouncing the Fugitive Slave Act in Boston in 1850. In the midst of this agitation, he heard a famous speech of Sumner's, "Our Immediate Anti-Slavery Duties," delivered at a meeting at Faneuil Hall on November 6th. Sumner cited Tintoretto's picture as a template for his own intervention. Quote, "There's a legend of the church still living on the admired canvas of a Venetian artist that St. Mark, descending from the skies with headlong fury into a public square, broke the manacles of a slave in presence of the very judge who had decreed his fate. This is known as the miracle of the slave, and grandly has art illumined the theme." Unquote. Several years later, in Europe, Sumner acquired his version of the composition. In 1860, Smith wrote to Sumner, introducing himself as one committed to, quote, "the elevation of his race," unquote. Throughout the 1860s, the correspondence between the two men shifted back and forth from Smith's work for Sumner, involving food, furniture, and other practical matters, to the pair's political preoccupations both during and after the war. The most striking of these letters dates to March 31st, 1870, the day after the final adoption of the 15th Amendment, giving African American men the franchise. Smith wrote, with a passion also evident in his rapid hand, "The great battle is over. Victory has been proclaimed. The second St. Mark has come. So have the chains been broken. The mantle of honor must rest upon your shoulders to the great champion, as the great champion of liberty of this or any other age. I can never forget the words spoken by you in Faneuil Hall. Let my people go. They have gone free. To you more than any other person the honor is due. I want to see you more than I ever did before, to thank you face to face for what you have done. God bless the Honorable Charles Sumner. Faithfully your friend, J.B. Smith." Sumner's decision to leave the picture to Smith must have crystallized as he read this note. One wonders if anything was said of it in the last hours of Sumner's life when Smith, by then a Massachusetts state senator from a Cambridge district, arrived at his friend's bedside with a gift of his own, the official revocation, proposed and engineered by Smith, of a hasty censure by that body of Sumner for having broached the idea of political compromise with a group of white Southern politicians. It should be emphasized that both Sumner's and Smith's attachment to the painting and the St. Mark narrative it illustrated was not to be confused with religious quietism about the evils of slavery, the idea that the slave would get his reward in the afterlife. Sumner was famously unattached to organized religion, and Smith, at an 1858 New Bedford anti-slavery meeting, had this to say: "It is a great misfortune that the colored man is so submissive. He is too religious in the wrong way. His fears are preyed upon. He is taught to look forward to the New Jerusalem as an asylum from all his woes. He wants a part of that New Jerusalem here. We were told that God in his own time would work out deliverance. God's time to do right is now." Such immediate deliverance is just what St. Mark provides in the Tintoretto composition. And my second excerpt. Samuel Clemens's first visit to Venice in 1867 was brief, but his account of it in Innocents Abroad includes a curious passage under the rubric of a contraband guide. Adopting his usual role as the untutored American encountering the mystifying complexities of European culture, Mark Twain, as we must call the narrator of this book, voices his naive admiration for a series of Venetian paintings, but he's briskly deflated by the cicerone who is in charge of his tour of the city. And this from Twain. In every single instance, the guide has crushed out my swelling enthusiasm with the remark, "It is nothing. It is of the Renaissance." I did not know what in the mischief the Renaissance was, and so I always had to simply say, "Ah, so it is. I had not observed it before." I could not bear to be ignorant before a cultivated Negro, the offspring of a South Carolina slave. But it occurred too often for even my self-complacency did that exasperating, "It is nothing, it is of the Renaissance." I said at last, "Who is this Renaissance? Where did he come from? Who gave him permission to cram the Republic with his execrable daubs?" We learned then that Renaissance was not a man, that Renaissance was a term used to signify what was at best but an imperfect rejuvenation of art. The guide I've spoken of is the only one we have had yet who knew anything. He was born in South Carolina of slave parents. They came to Venice while he was an infant. He's grown up here. He's well educated. He reads, writes, and speaks English, Italian, Spanish, and French with perfect facility, is a worshiper of art and thoroughly conversant with it, knows the history of Venice by heart, and never tires of talking of her illustrious career. He dresses better than any of us, I think, and is daintily polite. Negroes are deemed as good as white people in Venice, and so this man feels no desire to go back to his native land. His judgment is correct. Now, Twain, unfortunately, does not give a name to his African-American Venetian cicerone. Twain's reference to execrable Renaissance daubs indicates that the guide was evidently a thoroughgoing Ruskinian, and from Twain's description, the objects of the guide's disapproval were what would now be called Baroque or Rococo paintings, which Ruskin regarded as part of the late decadence of the Renaissance. Though Twain was ambivalent about the value of famous European pictures, he once suggested that old masters was short for old masturbators, his guide's words about Titian and Tintoretto stayed with him. A dozen years later, during his second trip to Venice, he recalled that the guide had described Tintoretto's enormous and chaotic paradise in the Ducal Palace as like, quote, "an insurrection in heaven," unquote. The word insurrection, most commonly used in Twain's day with regard to slave revolts and the Civil War, may be significant. Sam Clemens received perhaps his first real lesson in European art from the guide, but he also learned something else which was to have a far greater impact on his work and ultimately on American culture. Twain, of course, did not go on to write about African Americans in his fiction as if they were connoisseurs, but it can be argued that the encounter with this elevated man was a shock to his earlier prejudices. The passage in The Innocents Abroad stands as Twain's first, if still tentative, critique of American anti-Black racism. Tour guides were probably Twain's most popular target for mockery in Innocents Abroad, and he made a running gag of their obsequious, pompous, ignorant, and larcenous behavior. At first, with the Venice Guide's dismissals of the aesthetic value of the works Twain is attracted to, the passage appears to be headed in the same direction. But its tone quickly shifts. The guide's pedagogy is accepted, and his learning, refined bearing, and dignity are endorsed by a writer whose manners, if not his wit, were thought to be awkward by many of his fellow passengers along his European tour. There's humor in the guide's put down of Twain's taste, but it's not at the guide's expense. The passage ends with the blunt acknowledgement that the guide's decision to remain in Venice, rather than return to Reconstruction America, is the right one. In the text of Innocence, Twain is careful to delineate his Venetian guide as a man brought up in a cultured environment, as Clemens himself was not, and mentions slavery only as an attribute of the guide's parents. But the sectional heading for this passage, surely composed by the author himself, is given as a contraband guide. This introduces a distinctive metaphor, and one that in this period still held considerable power. As the Civil War began, fugitive slaves in the secessionist states started to make their way toward Union lines, and the practical, ethical, and legal problems of how to treat them immediately became apparent. For well over a year, slavery remained legal in the territories of both the secessionist and the border states, but few Union commanders were disposed to return this so-called human property to their legal owners in the Confederacy. General Benjamin Butler solved this problem by proclaiming the escaped slaves the property of rebels and thus liable to seizure by Union forces as contraband, illegal property. Contrabands could, of course, be a burden to the Union as they required food and shelter, but they could also offer significant advantage to the troops in the field as laborers. The number of such fugitives was large, perhaps around 500,000 people. The use of the term spread rapidly in 1862 and was increasingly applied to all African American laborers employed by the Union Army. Frederick Douglass objected to the term, with its implications that African American fugitives remained property, but not all people of color rejected it, and the newspapers began to speak of fugitives who were eager and able to make a contribution to the war effort by supplying intelligence about enemy forces in the areas from which they had fled as the intelligent contraband or the reliable contraband. Many contrabands were indeed able to serve as extremely well-informed guides in Confederate territory. Even before actual Black military units began to be formed in the U.S. Army after the Emancipation Proclamation, contraband guides demonstrated that African Americans could contribute in a potentially decisive way to the war effort. Okay, I think I'd like to turn it over to Adrian.
Hi, great to see you in this virtual venue, and I thank you and Krishna for inviting me to talk with you about your wonderful book. Both of us are kind of sometimes work in this kind of murky area between European art and culture and African American and Black life and Blackness. So it's fascinating to me that you are really able to weave together all these elements from literature, from history, from art history, and come up with and really fill in a lot of blanks that we have been dealing with, especially in terms of the 19th century, and gives us a sort of a broader perspective on how African Americans engaged, used, employed, conscripted European culture towards different ends, right, during that time. And so there are a lot of things you and I have already talked about. One thing before we do that is how you did such a great job with what do you call it? Archival research. And I'm sure everyone realizes that. I mean, this is an old-fashioned kind of research that not everybody is as good at as you are. And it's really admirable. So how did you even find Joshua Bowen Smith in this story?
Yeah, you know, a lot of it comes by happenstance. I mean, for this project, I've done a lot of archival work, especially for my earlier work on European art. For this project, the big resource was travel memoirs, right? And I read, 500 or 600 of them, mostly published, but a few in manuscript, right? To try to unearth all these kinds of things. Twain's Guide. I never found his name, alas. Sometimes the archival work doesn't end up where you desperately want it to end up.
Yeah.
But Joshua Bowen Smith was actually out there in the public record, but because the Shaw Memorial had two phases, people have spent very little time talking about the origins of it. St. Gaudens statue, which is, undoubtedly, one of the greater works of 19th century American art, has taken up all the air. And because Smith was gone by the time the actual work on the monument began to happen. Nobody had looked into him. And so in Joshua Bowen Smith's case, the mother lode was right in Houghton Library in Sumner's correspondence.
Can you turn us back to the monument so we can see it?
Sure.
So that brings me back to the question of just monuments in general. Throughout the book, in the parts that I read, there are other monuments that were conceived of by African Americans and unrealized. Several of them that you talked about were unrealized. So, and they also needed white patronage. And do you think it was, kind of obviously because the African Americans, it might be more difficult for them to get the money for a very expensive bronze monuments or other kind of systemic roadblocks? And white patronage, was it inevitable, and did it compromise things in some way?
I think compromise is an understatement. I mean, it's partly about the financing, although African Americans, especially right after the Civil War, proved very willing to contribute, not insignificant sums, but large public bronze statuary is very, very expensive, right? Yeah. And so ultimately that might have, but I would say resistance, especially before the war, to any kind of monument. I mean, there was this attempt in the 1850s to erect a monument in Boston to Crispus Attucks. And the Massachusetts legislature, after entertaining it for a moment, rejected it out of hand, even though, clearly a lot of the money for it was going to be raised privately, and they weren't, necessarily going to be charged a lot for it. After the Civil War, what happens is that these projects tend to be co-opted by members of the white establishment, and the moment of Reconstruction is so short, that projects even like the Shaw Memorial are kind of pulled away from the African American initiators of it, and then left to languish in the years after the end of Reconstruction. So I think a lot of it is political. I just want to add that there are the beginnings of African American sculptors in this period, including one that I write about in the book, Eugene Warburg. He has only 2 surviving works. One is actually an illustration of an abolitionist tract, Harriet Beecher Stowe's second novel, Dread, a character called Uncle Tiff from that novel. But it's only a foot tall. It's a reproducible ceramic work. It was not a public monument. The one more or less public monument, a bust that Warburg made that still survives, is the bust of one of his patrons who was a pro-slavery Southern politician who was serving in the American embassy in Paris. So insofar as African Americans can insert themselves into the process of memorialization, they can often only insert themselves in an extremely subordinate way and actually end up creating monuments to people that they probably really would not want to create monuments to.
Huh. Yeah, that's interesting because one of the things that I thought, and someone who studies the history of art and been looking, of course, a lot at African American art, 20th century, and that's all about identity, right? And many of the 19th century artists have to kind of go through this gauntlet of training and in European traditions. I mean, there is really no other alternative. But you kind of dug deep. You look at rhetoric by Frederick Douglass and all kinds of other people who are really using art and the idea of art for political purposes. Did you ever find any inkling of people thinking that European art wasn't serving their means, or that they had to perhaps find another kind of an aesthetic that would be more representative of African Americans, Negroes, whatever the term was at that time? Or that just really doesn't happen until the end of the 19th, early 20th century?
Yeah, I think the short answer is it really doesn't occur until the beginning of the 20th century. But I mean, the some of the promoters, from Douglas to a number of figures who are lesser known that I write about in the book, some of the promoters of this tradition specifically see European art as a way to get around elements of American racism. Mm-hmm. So they're not lumping the whole thing together, so to speak. They're seeing the European tradition as a way to circumvent some of the things that have developed in American art, I think. Mm-hmm. But there's so much around the time of the Civil War, with the opposition in the Black community to colonization ventures and so on, there's fear of being lumped in with African culture in many ways. That's not where the avant-garde of Black leadership is pointing in the years during and immediately after the Civil War. It's that African Americans should remain here and therefore need to construct a culture, out of American and or European components but a culture that's their own, to put themselves side by side with the other inhabitants of the country. But I don't think, I haven't seen any direct engagement with, let's say, the arts of Africa in any of the sources I've looked at least up through the 1880s. Yeah.
Or not even thinking about a different way that African Americans might represent themselves. But I did read some in what your book about people wanting more representations of African Americans, portraits, and wanting representation was very meaningful and had political power. But you're saying that the styles and the forms were still going to conform to the standards of the time.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. I mean, there isn't yet a consciousness, and this continues on into the early 20th century. I mean, still even in the period of the Harlem Renaissance, with Locke and so on, there continues to be an attempt to sort of validate Blackness through the European traditions of representation of it. Mm-hmm. And so even as an interest in the arts of Africa and kind of the ability to construct something that's not dependent on the Western tradition gradually becomes more important, that other element remains a component even into the early 20th century. Yeah,
it's still a push and pull about that. So that brings me to something I guess you hinted on, did you think African Americans saw their representation in European art as being more forgiving, the kind of exoticism and the beauty that could be a double-edged sword, as David Byman says. Hi, David, I know you're out there. That could be a double-edged sword, but in terms of people consuming it in real time, right? African Americans who may get images of European art from different ways in coming to America, or even going to Europe as artists and travelers. So did they see it as something that was more dignified?
So for that, I want to just take you to this work, which is a Netherlandish painting by an artist called Memoirs from the early 16th century. That's in the National Gallery in London. And the first African-American scholar to engage in a careful study of the historical record of American and European images of Blackness, Freeman Murray, he starts with this picture, which was one of the gems of the National Gallery in London. It had recently been acquired by the National Gallery. And he discusses the Black African wise man as well as his attendant, who you can see in this detail over here. Mm-hmm. And he praises the artist, but then he goes back and he says, why aren't American artists adopting this imagery? And he critiques American art for not having sufficiently observed this European tradition. And he even critiques rather gently Henry Ossawa Tanner for not having painted this story. Since Tanner painted so many sacred biblical images, why hasn't he taken this up and brought this part of the European tradition in a useful way for an African-American artist and an African-American audience?
That is really very interesting to me. Yeah. That's a good question. Many people have wondered why Tanner didn't do more, and they wondered why he didn't do more just to represent African Americans, because he's that transition figure who's coming out of the 19th century and starting to do something new. But it was it was a minefield, really. I
just want to add that Tanner's father, who was a noted preacher, a very important clergyman amongst the Black elite, had actually been involved long before Tanner became an artist, and when he was just a child or even earlier, in again promoting this kind of Western tradition as a means by which African Americans could quote unquote elevate themselves. So Tanner, who we think of really as a late 19th century, early 20th century figure, he comes out of this ferment about the arts and Blackness in the Civil War era.
Well, I know we're going to do question and answer soon. I just want to do one more question that I think about, and that's a lot of what you're talking about in the book are images of slavery, or rhetoric about slavery, because this is all around the Civil War, and there's a whole ideological torment going on. Come across images of slavery that are frank and visceral, I don't know, that depict the horrors of slavery. It seems like so many of them in the United States, certainly in Europe, are romanticized in some way. Because there's literature that talks about it. Do we ever find that in the visual record, other than maybe those photographs, some of the photographs?
Not so much, of course. There are images which clearly, there are a lot of images that aren't even clearly identified as images of slaves, right? It's been a long problem in European culture about how to particularly distinguish enslavement, right? Generally, it requires chains or something of that nature. But there are certainly images of slaves. But to give you an idea of how the punches are pulled, this is Harriet Beecher Stowe's favorite image of an African American. It was made by a Franco-British artist called Cumberworth in the middle of the 19th century. And it's really kind of an orientalized image of a Black woman whose breast is sort of slipping out of her falling garment, carrying a water jug. But curiously, Stowe bought a copy of this work, but she also wrote about it and said this was how she visualized Sojourner Truth as a young enslaved woman, right? Yeah. So if even Stowe, who doesn't hesitate to describe the violence involved with slavery, especially in her second slavery novel, if even she is sort of falling back on this kind of thing, you can see that it was pretty difficult to raise that kind of thing. I'm trying to think if I brought in anything else, but I don't think I have anything that would fall into that category. And frankly, there just isn't very much of it until the war and the aftermath, at which point you begin to get a little more frankness. And in the European tradition, there are some images, some very violent images of the violence to which enslaved people were subjected, but less so in the U.S.
Okay. Now, I didn't know whether we have any questions.
Let's see. We do have a few questions. One is, which do you find a more successful strategy for fighting the legacy of white supremacist aesthetics in Western European art? Robert Colescott's 1975 travesty of Leutz's 1851 Washington Crossing the Delaware, titled George Washington Carver Crossing the Delaware, or the elevation of lowly, exquisite portraits painted by Carrie James Marshall and Wiley.
Oh, I don't know. I don't know if I really want to choose, since I mean, I don't think there's just one. I guess I would say I don't think there's just one strategy for combating that. I mean, Cole Scott's work, you know, probably at least subliminally drove me to some of the research in this book, right? And you know, I think that kind of, I think the kind of parody of in that case the American tradition, because I think that's in particular what Cole Scott was after there, can be extremely valuable. You know, I would argue that embedded right in Leutz's painting, there's also a kind of critique of that tradition. Well, I write about that in the book, but that's not to take anything away from Cole Scott. As for Carrie James Marshall, you know, I don't know. I just think the work is spectacular, but it's just a completely different approach to problematizing the Western tradition in painting. It's one that comes closer to the kind of thing that Freeman Murray might have desired, a way of taking the tools of that Western tradition, but of so fundamentally altering those tools that they constitute a different point of departure. But I can't choose between those two. They seem to me to be both extremely effective.
So a more general question, how does this work, this current work of yours, relate to your previous work in European art?
Well, I have to give just a little bit of family history for this, which some of you on the panel know. I got into this field through my father. I mentioned that I had gone to Europe as a teenager, actually, in the 1960s. My father was an American Studies scholar who wrote mostly about, to begin with, African-American history, and then the literary representation of African-Americans in Melville and other 19th century authors, and finally started writing about the image of people of color in American art. I kind of served as a research assistant to him, and when we spent those years in Europe, especially the second time when I was 16, I was sort of deputized to help find European images. My dad wanted to know what the European antecedents of the American representation of Black figures was. And that got me interested in the field as a whole. And I went off to college and wrote a thesis about it, and went off to graduate school and wrote a dissertation about it. But of course, at the back of my mind, I kept remembering why I had started on the study of late medieval and Renaissance, early modern European representations. And sadly, it wasn't really until my father was no longer with us in the later 1990s that I began to return to this. And it was actually, I was just reading a little bit of Mark Twain. I was reading Innocents Abroad when I came across the passage that I read to you. And it was one which oddly my dad had never explored. I don't know why, but I thought, well, this provides a different view. This suggests a different kind of Black presence in Europe already in the 19th century. And equipped with what I already knew about the European tradition, I thought maybe I could add something by fusing the two more completely. So it's kind of a trip to my origins to write this book.
Thank you. David Weidman says he has more of a comment than a question. And he says, the Thomas Ball group on Capitol Hill of Lincoln Oh, the bust of Thomas Ball Group on Capitol Hill of Lincoln and a freed slave was paid for by ex-slaves, and
Yep.
Frederick Douglass spoke at its unveiling. There have been moves to have it taken down, so this brings up a topical issue.
Yeah. Well, that's very true. I kind of left out the Lincoln Monument by Ball because that was another kind of disappointment. The monument came to be, but it came to be in a form that is extremely subordinating for the Black subject. As a kneeling enslaved man, Lincoln towers above him, and it was a very vexed commission. So I just should mention, and I think I have the image here, that an earlier project for that memorial by Harriet Hosmer, American woman sculptor who, as so many American sculptors did in this period, lived in Rome. She proposed, and for a while this was the going project, a much larger work with Lincoln lying in state up here, but with at the corners, you can see three of the four African Americans, including one of whom is a contraband guide. Okay, this was a project of the 1860s. I believe that the Ball statue in Boston, because there are two copies of it, one in Washington and one in Boston, I believe that's either come down or is coming down, right? And I have to say that I pretty much truly despise the Ball Monument. Should it be destroyed? No, of course not. But should it serve as a public monument? I think it's far past, I think it was probably past its expiration date at the time it was made, but I think it's now far past its expiration date. So, you know, I think we need to also think forward to new monuments. One of the things that I stumbled across in my research was a proposal by Henry Highland Garnett, one of the most prominent abolitionists before and during the Civil War, who, in commemorating the Emancipation Proclamation, one of his recommendations was that in the most elevated cemetery in New York, Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn, he wanted to see memorials to the great leaders of slave revolts in the pre-Civil War period. I'd like to propose that sculptors, in particular sculptors of color, consider taking up that project again and going forward with it. I think one of the things that the past can do is actually give us some ideas about the kind of monuments that we might want going forward.
I just heard someone, of course I forgot who it was, but they were very important, saying that they thought we should just abolish the whole tradition of monuments altogether, and because permanent monuments, that they should be more ephemeral, more kind of lived and experienced, and then they die their own death, because of the fact that every time, you know, the tides change so much and opinions and politics change so much that they're going to eventually be retarded tear. They're going to eventually be past their prime. Now, I don't know that that's necessarily what we should do, but that was an idea, because his idea was let's just deal with contemporary artists doing impermanent kinds of tributes to whatever, you know, the issue is. So the whole concept of the monument is, I think, in flux right now.
Yeah, I think it's true. I mean, there are some essential problems with it, but I am married to an artist.
Yes.
She's not a sculptor, but still, it certainly wouldn't be in the interests of artists to have the monument abolished, since in so many times and places, these are the ways in which artists have fed themselves. So I think that would be one reservation I would have about the end of the permanent monument. But the ephemeral monument, I think there's a lot of potential there. And I don't see why not. I mean, the other problem with the permanent monument is it requires such a generation of economic resources to get there, that by the time you get to the monument itself, you're sometimes exhausted, right? And again, the fate of the Lincoln Monument is a good case of it. If Hosmer's design could have gone up, I think we'd still be admiring it. But both for financial and ideological reasons, it got dragged back down to Ball's work.
Now I have a set of questions for you by one of the participants or one of the attendees, and they're related to what we've been talking about just now. So how do European tools actually conscript the Black or African imagination? And what are some conceptual questions to ask when trying to break out of the Western indoctrination that the Academy ushers students into, to make Black art or African art that is actually offering something new rather than simply reconfiguring the master's tools?
Well, I'm an art historian, and so I think I am not the best person to try to answer that question. I think a practicing artist is the person, nor am I a contemporary critic, right? Who might also be in a position to do that. My role as a scholar is to try to unearth what the record is, what's actually out there. So much has been concealed since the creation of many of these objects, even objects of recent vintage from the 19th century. What then needs to be done with it, how it can serve either as an object lesson or as an inspiration, and I think the art of the past can serve as both, that has to be left to the creator. The art historian can clarify, the art historian can make clear what the ideological content of the works are in a variety of ways. But I'm not sure it's the place of the art historian to decide upon the next stage of creation. Okay, so I am sort of avoiding the question, but I think it's beyond my pay grade in some ways. But object lesson or inspiration, that's what we can find in this, but not maybe a way of escaping from it. The study of the thing itself is not the most likely way to escape from its grip.
And I'll just weigh in about, historically, of course, the early modernists were trying to escape, European modernists were trying to escape from the tyranny of academic art and the European quote unquote tradition, and they went through African art, and that eventually filters into African American artists who took that followed the sort of opened the door that was open there. But of course, that whole chapter was controversial because who's leading the charge of the European avant-garde, who's Picasso and Matisse, the Karl Einstein, a lot of European artists and thinkers who were trying to take off that yoke, but they were still establishing a new dominant tradition, which was modernism. And so that became a bone of contention for African American artists to a certain extent, but it also was liberating. So it was liberating in that's when they started realizing that there were a lot more ways in and through to their own expression that didn't have to be subservient to this European tradition. But again, on the other side, the African art in some ways was the European tradition of that moment. But people have subsequently, I think, broken that yoke, and then returned to it for whatever reason. So it's going to be like an individual, like Paul said, an individual choice for the artist. And so that I just, in terms of what tools, I guess that the question was, what tools could we use, right? Or could artists use to break those yokes? It is a personal thing, but there has been a lot of experience in that throughout the 20th century, trying to work that out.
Thank you. Maybe one last question, and Paul, you may have touched upon this already a little bit. But in your view, how did Douglas's writings, newspaper writings, kind of influence the exchange between Europe and America in the representation of race in the visual
Yeah,
arts?
it's really interesting. You know, there's the wonderful book on the study of Douglas in photography that came out a couple of years ago, which has sort of opened up this field a little bit. But in my research, I've come across Douglas in several different contexts, and he's quite interested, not only in the power of photography, but the power of more traditional art forms. And he approaches it in different ways. Probably the earliest material is his quick seizure of one of the most famous parodies in the history of the representation, the Western representation of people of color, which was a print. I'm afraid I don't have it in my slides here. Should have put it there. But it's a parody of Hiram Power's Greek Slave, this image in white marble of an emphatically white enslaved woman, right, in chains. Punch magazine in England in the middle of the 1840s had already published a parody of this work in which an enslaved Black woman stands on a pedestal. It's a work which I think today we look at as a kind of racist image, but it was perceived in the time as an abolitionist image, a challenge to the hypocrisy of those white Americans and Europeans who abhorred slavery when it was one of their own who was enslaved, but couldn't see their way to explicitly condemning the enslavement of people of color. And so Douglas grabbed it quickly and republished. He actually republished several parodies, verbal and visual, in his own newspaper in the 1840s. So he was extremely alert at that time. In the period a little bit later, he begins to critique. He says that white Europeans and Americans, especially white Americans, are so afraid of Blackness that they can't even come to grips with bronze sculpture. Okay. And he recommends, ironically, that a European sculptor who wants Americans to come and buy things would have to segregate his studio between the white marble and the dark bronze. But again, he uses this example, this sort of transatlantic consumption of art example, as one of his many attacks on hypocrisy. So there's actually quite a rich vein of discussion in Douglas about these issues.
Thank you. Well, this was a fascinating conversation and very important for the times. Thank you so much, Paul and Adrian.
Thank you.
Thanks, Adrian. Thanks, Krishna.